Hello, welcome to Naresh Technologies. This is Sudhakar Sharma. We are continuing the session of ADO.NET Entity Framework. In our previous sessions of ADO.NET Entity Framework, we discussed about what is ADO.NET Entity Framework, what are the key features of ADO.NET Entity Framework, and how Entity Framework architecture works. Means we discussed about the framework architecture. What are all the components of entity framework and how it works. After understanding all these concepts, now we have to discuss about what is the library for entity framework. We have to discuss about the library for entity framework. Means in order to use the various approaches provided by ADO.NET Entity Framework, as already we discussed that entity framework provides three different approaches: code first approach, database first approach, and model first. In order to handle all these three types of approaches, we have to use the base library provided by the entity framework. Actually, entity framework requires two important libraries. One is defined under system.data.entity. Another one is system.component model. In order to deal with entity framework, we need two important libraries. One entity library, another one component model. This data.entity namespace, it will provide some important classes like we have DB context, we have a DB set, and we have database. What is the role of these DB context, DB set and database, we will see. And component model, it comprises of some set of attributes. These attributes are responsible for representing the data we are working with. Entity library provides all the classes which are responsible for communicating with the database, connecting with the database, reading the data from database, changing, updating, deleting. All such operations are supported under the library system.data.entity. And component model will provide a set of attributes that are used to represent the data we are working with. That means we discussed that in entity framework we write according to the business requirement. That means we are not writing for the database, we are writing for the domain specific classes. In that situation, the question is how our business classes are going to map with the database tables. You are saying that you can communicate with the database tables by using your domain specific classes. Then how these classes are mapping towards those tables? For that we need some set of attributes. Those all attributes are defined under this component model. The attributes in the component model are categorized into two types again. We have schema attributes, another one we have model attributes. Before going into the concept of what is a schema attribute and model attributes about component model, first we will discuss about this entity library. So, in order to deal with entity framework in our ADO.NET, we have to use two important libraries. One is entity library, another one component model library. Entity library provides the classes DB context, DB set and database. Component model will provide some set of attributes which are categorized into schema attributes and model attributes. First we will take a look about what is this entity library. The entity library comprises of three important classes. One is DB context, DB set and database. DB context is a class which is using a DB connection. It is using a DB connection. DB context is a class which is using a DB connection. Generally, DB connection is already being used by your SQL connection, OLEDB connection, ODB connection. In general ADO.NET, all the connection classes are implemented from a DB connection. And here entity framework, in entity framework, DB context is using a DB connection. That means an object of DB context is responsible for connecting with the database. That means how you can connect with database, Generally, DB connection will use a connection string through which it will connect to the specific data source, and this DB connection is being used by the DB context of entity framework. So, what is DB context class in entity framework? DB context class will provide some set of attributes, some set of properties and methods through which you can connect with the database. DB context is responsible for various operations like track changing, query translation, object materializations. All such activities are handled by using a DB context. So, in entity framework, one important class is a DB context class. DB context class is responsible for communicating with the database, connecting with the database. Open the connection, close the connection, transactions, all these are handled by using the DB context class. So, then what is a DB set? Actually, the DB context is a collection of DB sets. It will connect with the database and also it will configure a collection of DB set, and each DB set will represent an entity. That means it will represent the tables you are working with. Now, you can read and write the values into the tables by using the DB set. A DB set will provide some set of properties through which you can read and write values into the entities. So, every entity is representing a table in the database. So, DB context will connect with the database and DB set will be responsible for interacting with the tables inside the database. And all these DB sets are accessible with the reference of DB context, because DB context is a collection of DB set. So, context will connect with the data source and DB set will be responsible for reading and writing the values into the entity. Here entity is the table, means communicating with the database table is managed by using DB set. And database is a class in entity framework which defines the strategy. As we already discussed that there are various strategies in entity framework, like whether to create the database for your logic or use an existing database, whether to drop the database every time and add the new features, whether to keep the database and allow the changes. All such strategies are defined by using database. So, whenever you are using entity framework, it is very important to define the strategy. Strategy will tell whether to create the database or to use the existing database, and you can configure the strategies for entity framework by using database. So, entity framework will provide the library system.data.entity with three important classes: DB context, DB set and database. DB context object is responsible for connecting with the data source, and DB set is responsible for representing the tables, that is entities, so that we can read and write values into the tables, and database is a class which defines the strategy. So, all these classes are defined in the system.data.entity. Now, another important library that we need in ADO.NET Entity Framework is the component model library. What is component model? Component model is nothing but component model will provide some annotations. These annotations are responsible for representing the POCO classes. We call the classes as POCO, plain old CLR objects, POCO classes. POCO classes are nothing but POCO classes are domain specific. POCO classes are domain specific classes. That means in entity framework we are saying that .NET developers will eliminate most of the data access code, and they will always now write for the domain specific, means a business requirement. In that situation, now very important is our C# classes must represent a database table we are working with, and they must be mapped to the database table so that they can interact with the table. So, here the point is how your C# class is mapped to a database table, how the fields in the class are mapped to the fields inside the database table. That is handled by using the library component model. It will provide a set of attributes that are categorized into two types. We have schema attributes. These schema attributes are defined under the namespace system dot component model dot data annotations dot schema. So, the namespace system dot component model dot data annotations dot schema, this namespace will provide the attributes which are responsible for defining the structure of the table. Schema means we know that schema defines the structure. That means schema contains of attributes that are used to define the table structure. And what are the important attributes available in the schema? One, we have a table, we have a column, and another we have a foreign key. So, these three are very important attributes which are defined under the component model data annotations dot schema. That means if you are creating a C# class and you want this class to map to the database tables, then you have to design the class as per the structure of the table. Table name, field name, data types, all these must be defined according to the structure of the database table. Then for that we can use these attributes. So, schema attributes of component model are responsible for defining the structure of the table that you are working with. How? I will show you just basic overview. For example, we have a class by name some product, and this class is having some members like public, int, product ID. It is a simple attribute, so just a get set accessor for that, and we have a public string name and a get set accessor for this. Now we have a public decimal price and a get set accessor here. Now very important is how this C# class is going to map with a database table. For example, in the database we have a table called TBL products. Now this class should map to this table TBL products. Then we have to mark this class with an attribute table, and this table attribute will tell to which database table it should be mapped to, that is some TBL products. So the class product is now mapped to a database table called TBL products. So it represents the database table called TBL products. Similarly, if I want the name or data type for the field to be defined, like product ID or name or price, by default these properties are directly mapped to the database table fields. If you want to define a different name for the field, if you want to define a different data type for the field, that you can define by using the attribute called column. So column is table is an attribute. The table attribute is responsible for mapping your C# class to a database table. Column is an attribute which is responsible for mapping your properties to a database field column, and foreign key is an attribute which is used as a navigation property in your class, so that it will map to the foreign key attribute available in your database table. So schema attributes, three important attributes are there: table, column and foreign key. Table is used to map to a database table, column is used to map to a database table column, and foreign key is for the navigation property. It maps to the foreign key in the table. So these are schema annotations. So component model contains schema annotations which are responsible for mapping our C# class to a database table. It is responsible for structuring it. Now we have another set of annotations and we call them as model annotations. Model annotations are defined under system.componentModel dot data annotations. So we have two sets, one component model dot data annotations dot schema, and another one we have data annotations. Now this data annotations will provide some set of properties which are used to define the behavior of the model fields. That means when you are designing your domain specific classes, whatever the properties you defined in the class, that means in our previous class we designed the product ID, name and decimal. Now if they are mapping towards a database field, then we have to set some restrictions for the database field, such as like now I want my C# class property to be a primary key. It should map to a primary key to the database table. Then we have to use an attribute key. There is another attribute required. We have an attribute max length. We have an attribute min length. We have an attribute as string length. By using these attributes, you can define the behavior of the model fields. That means whenever you design a domain specific class and you want this class to be mapped to the database table, in the database table the fields may have some restrictions and we want our columns to be mapped with these properties present inside the class. In that situation, how you can designate a primary key, how you will designate a required field, how you will designate the minimum and maximum number of characters can be entered into the field, that you can define by using the model annotations. So what is key? Key is a property which will map to the primary key of the database table. For example, in this class, suppose I want the product ID to be the primary key of the table, then I need to designate this with an attribute key. Later in practical approach, while dealing with various code first, model first approaches, we will practically implement this and see how it creates or maps to the primary key. So it is just an overview of how do we designate our classes that can interact with the model database tables. So key is an attribute which will map to the primary key. Similarly, now I want the name to be mandatory. That means generally in database we have a database table, we have a field name, and that field name is a nullable type. or you want to make it mandatory, then you have to designate it as a non-nullable type. If name is a non-nullable type, here you are representing the name as a string type in C#, but C# string type is nullable, and in your database you are saying that it is non-nullable. Then how I can make this nullable type as non-nullable type? Then we can mark this with an attribute called required. This indicates that this field must have a value and it cannot be empty. So such attributes can be defined by using the annotations. So what is the minimum and maximum length of characters can be entered? So the string length will define the minimum and maximum length of characters can be entered. So data annotations comprises of two sets of attributes. One, we have schema attributes, which are responsible for defining the structure of the table, and three important schema attributes are there: table, column and foreign key. And we have model annotations. Model annotations are used to define the restrictions and behavior of the fields, that means database table fields. And what are the important attributes? We have key, required, max length, string length like attributes. These are all defined under the library component model.data annotations, and schema attributes are defined under data annotations.schema. So finally, to deal with entity framework, we need two libraries. One, the entity library and the component model. Let's see the summary of the classes which are required for entity framework. So we need three important namespaces. One is system.data.entity. It provides the classes, one DB context, another one DB set, another one database. We need another library, system.component model, component model dot data annotations dot schema. It will provide three important attributes. We have a table attribute, we have a column attribute, and we have a foreign key attribute. We have another system.component model dot data annotations. It will provide attributes like key and required and max length and string length. These are the important attributes and namespaces that are required to deal with entity framework. Now after understanding the library, what is required for entity framework, now we will practically see the various approaches how we can interact with entity frame database and tables by using ADO.NET entity framework. In the next session of entity framework, we will see the practical approach of how do we work with code first approach in ADO.NET. Thank you.